going on, everybody? It's Monday, and you know what Monday means. It means it's the day where we all take a minute to go over your responses from my questions to you. And my question last week was your take on vintage baseball versus vintage football. And I know some of us are just vintage baseball. We're baseball only, and we don't really care that much about vintage football. And some of us are heavy into vintage football, and we love vintage football. Some of the questions and comments I get most frequently are asking me to do more topics, more shows, more discussion on vintage football. Now, I don't think that you need to be a vintage football collector to be interested in hearing about this particular topic. And here's why. One of the reasons that a lot of people think vintage baseball is going to forever be in the lead and forever be the most in demand are things that are worthy of talking about. This could be an opportunity for you to hear other people say why you think baseball will continue to be the premier vintage cards to collect. But then it's also possible that people might share some ideas and make you go, oh, that's a good point. Maybe football is going to catch up. We had a little of each. In the responses from last week, we had people say, no chance football ever comes anywhere close to baseball. And some people said, yes, absolutely, football will catch and pass baseball. And some people said, maybe, and some people said, eventually. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for each. And that's what we're going to talk about. I think it was a very interesting, I get, a lot of the times, I get comments on these questions and responses to the questions. I felt like there were more responses to this week's question than normal. And what that tells me is it's a topic that a lot of people certainly have interest in. And I think that you will too, if you hear some of the variety of responses from everybody out there. Now, this past weekend was a super fun weekend. On Friday, we did the live stream, the 5,000 subscriber live stream, celebration. It was so much fun, and I had several people on. If you haven't watched it yet, I would encourage you to check it out. There were a few things that were definitely highlights. Having several of my friends from the YouTube community on, that was a highlight. Mookie Chilson showed his face. He came on video, and he was on for quite a while. That was outstanding. Mookie also did a little bit of a roast. He did a little stand-up act, which was fantastic. And then we unveiled the new logo, the second MidLife Sports Cards logo that my friend Scott from Reindeer Studios put together and created. And what that means is there are going to be a couple of different logos that I use from time to time. Now, also it was talked about and unveiled that there is the opportunity to buy some MidLife Sports Card merch, some shirts. See, this is one of the shirts that I have from Scott from Reindeer Studios. But he has now on his website live some shirts of a few different designs from the MidLife logo that he recently created. You could buy hoodies, you could buy shirts. You can represent the MidLife Nation. I hope that you'll consider doing it. And I know that some people are going, oh my gosh, Greg, you think that you could start selling merch now? I just want everyone to know, just straight up, any shirt or hoodie that is sold, I don't make a dime. Okay, this is not a money-making venture for Greg. This is just about spreading the love, having people be able to feel included in the community. And I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you. I look forward to going to shows, going to the National, going to Strongsville, going to local card shows, and seeing people in MidLife gear. And if you show up at one of those shows in MidLife gear, I'm going to request that we take a selfie together. I look forward to doing that. So If you see me at shows, or plan on seeing me at shows, grab a shirt. I want to take that selfie at the next card show. I think it'd be fun. But my friend Scott is an incredible artist, and he has so many different awesome card themed gear, shirts, hoodies, different things on his Etsy page, on his website. And so down below in the description, I'm going to have a link permanently, and it's going to take you to his homepage. Now, maybe you don't want a MidLife shirt. Maybe you don't want a MidLife hoodie. That's fine. He has tons of stuff, just like this Piedmont shirt. I bought directly off of it myself. So you can go to the home page, and if you're interested in buying any of his cool stuff, I would really encourage you to do it. He recently became a full-time artist. He said to the other job, nope, not anymore. I'm going all in on this, and I want to support him. He's got a great YouTube channel, by the way, as well, which is called Reindeer Studios. So if you're not following him, check him out. He was on the live stream on Friday night. And we also have a little short collaboration video coming up that we'll be posting probably this weekend, would be my guess. Now, let's go ahead and dive into this whole vintage football versus vintage baseball. And does vintage football have any chance of catching or getting close to catching vintage baseball cards at any point in the future? Let's check out what you guys had to say. Now, some of you said, yes, it's very possible. After a comment about the previous week's question, he says, I believe it's possible vintage football could challenge vintage baseball. Football is arguably more popular than baseball, so vintage football could and should become more popular in the hobby. Another comment says, I'm going to address your question about the possible popularity of football card collecting catching up to baseball. In my opinion, it is already happening, but not there yet. With the NFL expanding to other countries with games in Germany, UK, Mexico, and this year Brazil, American football is becoming more of an international sport. I would think that will continue the trend towards popularity of football cards being as popular as baseball. As far as modern cards, we are already there, with football likely being as popular or more popular than baseball cards. Vintage is lagging behind, but with the dirt cheap prices of vintage football compared to vintage baseball, it will continue to close the gap. I have been a collector of vintage football and baseball cards for 50 years, and it seems to me that football was less popular due to being an exclusive American sport. I would say people better jump on those vintage football cards now before the spike in value and cost in the coming years. And finally, a third comment says, I think vintage football will close the gap due to the simple fact that the popularity of pro football continues to outgrow the popularity of pro baseball, though I don't think it will ever be on the same level. The rare cards in the 1935 National Chickle football card set will be a safe place to park one's money, I believe. Now, most people that responded, said, no, Greg, vintage football is not going to catch vintage baseball. But as we just heard, a few people said, yeah, it's very possible. It could happen, it should happen, it will happen. And I think that it's important to look at all of the different aspects to the responses. And the people that are saying, yes, it will, I think that they make some good points. Now, I've talked about this topic a little bit in the past. Like about a year ago, I did a couple of videos about, is vintage football on the rise and will it start catching baseball? And when I talked about it, I said that there are a lot of reasons that I think it could close the gap, and I think that it will close the gap. Now, personally, I don't think it will catch baseball, vintage baseball. I don't think that's going to happen. And we're going to look at some of the reasons that other people mentioned, and I think that overwhelmingly that's the support, is that vintage baseball will hold the lead indefinitely. And we'll look at why. But I do think that the points that are made here are really good points. You know, number one, football has become more global. You know, the expansion of baseball has been, you know, Latin America started coming in the 60s and 70s and now is a major influence on Major League Baseball. You know, Japan has had some players starting to kind of come in about the 60s, but now there's a lot of players that come over. I mean, arguably the best player in the world right now came from Japan. And so there's definitely a global impact that has already been happening when it comes to baseball. But I think that football has done a good job of expanding. You know, basketball under David Stern did a pretty good job a few years ago, where they started making basketball more of a global sport. And I think the NFL doing some games in the UK, I think, you know, Germany, Mexico, now Brazil, like that's definitely going to help grow the game by bringing, you know, more attention to it worldwide. Now, is that in itself going to be enough to make it a global sport where people are there now going to say, well, I want to collect cards from the 50s and 60s? Probably not, but it certainly can't hurt. You know, and the other point that's kind of talked about here several times is that, you know, in the 50s and 60s, baseball was absolutely king of sports in America. And we're going to take a closer look at that here in a few minutes with some of the other responses saying that football will never catch baseball. But I do think that it's kind of hard to dispute that right now the most popular sport is football, at least in the United States. And so if it's number one with current viewership, with current fans, I mean, even I've talked to a lot of collectors, a lot of people in the YouTube community that are, you know, viewers, that are content creators. They love baseball, but they love the history of baseball. Like, a lot of you still watch baseball. You still watch a lot of the games. But a lot of people just watch occasionally. But what they love about baseball is not the current game. It's the game from the 50s and 60s. It's the game from that golden era. So the question then, I think, becomes, what does that look like moving forward? If a lot of young people are focused on basketball and football and they're not really focused on baseball, then will those people who are collecting modern football cards eventually move into vintage football cards? You know, most of us that are vintage card collectors, we weren't 8 years old and we started trying to buy vintage cards. Most of us were opening packs of modern cards. And then as we got older and we started having more appreciation for history, we started to move backwards in our collecting, right? I started opening packs of 1987 Topps baseball cards. And now I'm buying cards from the turn of the century. So is that going to continue? I don't know. But if current football fans and current modern football collectors start to go backwards and start to collect older stuff like most of us did, which as we got older, we collected older and before us and before that and before that, then there's definitely an opportunity. And, you know, the other part that's mentioned is that the value of vintage football is so much cheaper than vintage baseball. And we all know that everything is about supply and demand. Well, the supply of vintage football is less than vintage baseball. It's just a fact. There's more vintage baseball than vintage football. So if the supply is less, that must mean for the prices. The prices are way less for football. You know, if you take a guy that had Otto Graham status, but in baseball, that card is worth way more than an Otto Graham rookie card. Or a Sammy Baugh rookie card versus the same year, the top baseball players. It's not even close. So if the supply is less of the vintage football, which it is, and the price is significantly less, that's gotta mean that that's because the demand is significantly less for vintage football. So if the demand were to change just a little bit, if it were to increase just a little bit, it seems like it would make a fairly significant change in the price because the supply is so low. It's an interesting topic, and I appreciate the fact that some people said, yes, it's certainly possible, and yes, it's going to happen. But then a lot of people said, Greg, no chance. Let's take a look at kind of where they were coming from. Some people said, it's not possible, at least not anytime soon. Not interested in vintage football cards, with the exception of Jim Thorpe, Johnny Unitas, Paul Hornung, and of course the great Jim Brown. There is no way football will ever compete with vintage baseball because of baseball's glorious past and history. But I do enjoy football, especially during the days of the aforementioned players. And my friend Orlando says, great choices. Football won't overtake baseball in my lifetime, but I'm old. Definitely the gap is closing, and people are realizing football is more popular now, and cards are cheaper and rarer than baseball. I appreciate the bluntness of James. He says, no chance, won't happen. I like football. I like especially football back then, but it's just not going to happen. And I think that you're not alone in feeling that way. You know, and then Orlando says, yeah, no, not in my lifetime it's not going to happen. But then he says, but I'm old. You're not that old, Orlando. You're not going anywhere anytime soon. It's not happening. So, but, you know, I think that most of the audience, most of the people watching would agree that it's probably not going to happen. But the question is, why is it not going to happen? Why is football? I mean, if I had probably 20 responses to this question, I had 2 or 3, the ones we just looked at a few minutes ago, that said, yes, it will happen. That means everybody else either said probably not or no. So clearly the overwhelming majority is saying no. And I don't disagree. I don't disagree that the answer is probably not or no. But I do think that there's a lot of upside in vintage football, specifically because the prices are so cheap. They just really are. So let's kind of look at a few of the reasons that were kind of themed together of why a lot of people think no, vintage football is not going to catch vintage baseball. Let's take a look at the first one here. Some said no because stats and schedules have changed too much. I think the drastic changes to the NFL game and schedule hurt the chances for vintage football cards taking over. Additionally, the NFL and football fans do not celebrate the game's pioneers. I believe this started around the late 90s. I remember as a kid hearing about Johnny Unitas as an all-time great, but rarely hear his name anymore. With the exploits of a Travis Kelce or Rob Gronkowski, rarely do you hear about Kellen Winslow, Jackie Smith, or Mike Ditka, the player. Whereas, to this day, current MLB players are compared to all-time greats. Kids still grow up hearing about Musial, Aaron, etc. Go to almost any ballpark, and history is on display. Additionally, baseball cards have a consistent history, while football cards have a more disjointed history. Without having statistics that are comparable, I don't think vintage football will ever be close to baseball. I'm in my mid-30s, and there just isn't a ton of film on the 50s to 60s era sports. Not every game was televised like it is now. So much of the vintage MLB is left to the imagination and looking up stats on Baseball Reference. I mean, these are really, really good points. And some of the better written responses were these ones. Now, baseball has done everything it can to preserve the integrity of the statistics. They've tried really, really hard not to change. And that's one of the problems with baseball, is that it hasn't really changed. And as people's attention span has shortened in a digital world, a lot of people have a hard time with the down moments of baseball. And they've done some things very recently, you know, with the pitch clock and the number of times you can step out and stuff, that they've been trying to kind of fight that battle. But for the most part, the integrity of the stats are pretty much intact because of the lack of change in baseball. Whereas in football, there are significant rule changes that have happened for a long time. I mean, everything from grabbing receivers to protecting passers to personal fouls on, you know, hitting above certain areas and below certain areas. And they've done a lot to protect the biggest contracts, the most important players, the quarterbacks. And it's made it very much a passing league. And because of that, it makes the stats have to be era-based. You cannot compare the stats of a Sammy Baugh or an Otto Graham to, you know, a Tom Brady or a Drew Brees. You just can't compare them because the game is so different. It is so different. And the other thing about it is the length of the length of the schedule. Just even, you know, recently they add a game to the schedule, and the season is much longer. And because of the equipment that the players have in football, they're able to last a little bit longer because the rules are protecting them physically. The equipment is protecting them physically. And the season is longer. So because of how dramatically the game has changed, it's really, really difficult to even compare Joe Montana to Tom Brady. And those guys, their careers virtually, you know, were right next to each other. They almost overlapped, right? So when you look at something like that, and then you try to compare some of these vintage football players to modern football players, the stats of those guys, the stats of the vintage players, they're not even anywhere near the record books. If you look at the top 10 passers of all time in football, like, they're all recent. None of them are the old guys. But if you look at the top 10 home run hitters of all time, a lot of them are vintage guys. The rules have not changed very much. And so what happens is the records have not changed very much. And by the records not changing very much, the former players are still so relevant. And they're so relevant because it's like, oh, this guy's approaching, you know, on the home run total list, you know, Harmon Killebrew. So you hear those names because those guys are still toward the top of the record books. I mean, the length of careers are actually, seems like, getting shorter. The starting pitchers pitch much less. They're going to have the most unbreakable record ever is Cy Young's win total. I mean, you think anyone's going to have 500 wins? Like, it's very possible no one else will ever have 300. So 500 is impossible. It's never going to be broken. So that will always be there. But like the passing totals of a prolific quarterback, those guys aren't even anywhere on the first page of the record books from the 50s. So there's no doubt about it. That's played a big factor. Let's look at another reason that's brought up by a few of you. Let's check this out. Others said no because of the legendary status of baseball players. I think vintage football cards may increase in popularity over time, but I don't think they will ever come close to vintage baseball because baseball is Americana. No vintage football players have the name recognition of even second and third tier baseball Hall of Famers, not to mention the sheer volume of vintage baseball sets in comparison to football. As a football fan, I'd like to say yes to the popularity question. Realistically, the gap may narrow, but baseball will always be king. Red Grange, Jim Thorpe, Sammy Baugh, and Otto Graham just don't have the legendary status of Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Dimaggio, and Jackie. 60s cards have a better chance of closing the gap. Jim Brown and Joe Namath have more legend behind them. Mickey Mantle and Hank Aaron will always be more legendary, though. At least it will be easier on my wallet. And a third comment in the same line of thinking, it appears football is king with modern cards today. Given that popularity, I can definitely see vintage football closing the gap over the years. However, I have a hard time coming up with a scenario where it actually overtakes baseball. You have the legend of Ruth and Gehrig, the history of all-time greats leaving their prime to fight in World War II, the golden age of cardboard. There's so much culture and Americana baked in, it'll be hard to surpass. There's no doubt that when baseball was the absolute top of the heap in the 1950s and 60s, it was a really, really important time in the country's history and the world's history, really. A lot was happening. You know, television was starting to occur, right? We went from a radio age to a television age. We're coming out of the Great Depression and into a time of economic prosperity. We had World War II. And because of all of those things, and we had the integration of baseball and sport. And all of those things kind of all happened in about a 10-year window. And when that happens in about a 10-year window, it makes for a lot of history is made in a short period of time. And a lot of that history that was made involved sport and entertainment. And the sport that was at the top was baseball. So names like Joe Dimaggio and Mickey Mantle and Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, like these names that were the names during, you know, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, during this stretch of time, they, you know, Hank Aaron, we know the names, right? But because so much happened, those names are like, they're literally in the history books. Like I remember in my U.S. history classes, both in high school and in college and in elementary school, you learn about Jackie Robinson. You learn about Willie Mays. You learn about, you know, Hank Aaron and Mickey Mantle. Like Joe DiMaggio. Their names are like part of history. They're part of American history. But because football wasn't as big at the time, it was nothing like it is now. Those names aren't really in the history books. Like, do you remember learning in elementary school about Jim Brown? Probably not. But do you remember learning about Jackie Robinson? Absolutely. So part of that is some of these icons, some of these guys that were major celebrities, you know, missed part of their career because they went off to war. I mean, imagine being a Red Sox fan and having Ted Williams gone for a couple of years because he's fighting for the country. You know, Yogi Berra was a part of D-Day. That's wild. Bob Feller, Warren Spahn, lots of these guys served time in the military defending the country during this period in which baseball was so important to the country's fabric. And as a result, a lot of these names, as you know, live TV is happening, as video is beginning, and we're seeing these clips of these players for the first time, it's kind of part of what we were watching, or I wasn't alive, but what people were watching was baseball players. These major celebrities play baseball. So the name recognition for baseball is like literally in the history books. Sammy Baugh is not in any history book I saw. Otto Graham isn't in my U.S. history book. But most history books have some of those other names. They'll have a Joe Dimaggio. They'll have a Jackie Robinson. They'll have a Hank Aaron. Like, they come up. So absolutely the name recognition is much greater for these baseball players than football players. And that's probably not going to change anytime soon. So personally, my opinion is going to stay what it has been. My opinion is that I think football, vintage football, is very undervalued. And I believe that it will go up in value. It will get more appreciation than it's currently getting. And because of the lower supply, it will close the gap. I don't think it's going to ever pass baseball. I've never claimed it would pass baseball. But I do think it will start to catch up some of the values. Now, is that investment advice? Absolutely not. You know, just like telling you to go buy a lottery ticket this weekend, that's not investment advice either. It's just, I think more people are going to start to have an interest in vintage football. I think because of the lower supply, the prices will start to catch up some, but I don't think it will ever pass vintage baseball. That's my take. Now, I think that this is an interesting take, but it's not, you know, a news flash. I think that everybody who responded had some fantastic answers. In fact, when I first went through them, I was polling different responses, and I had like 15. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I just read all 15 of these, it's going to be a half hour. And then you add in my long-winded responses, and we're going to be at like 2 hours. So I had to cut it way back to just a handful or so of responses. But the responses were outstanding. Now, with all of this in mind, and all of this that we just talked about here, about how important baseball during the 1950s was. And also, we know it's important because look at what happened to baseball cards in the 1950s. They really got standardized. They really became popular. They really took off. So with that, for this upcoming week, here's my question to all of you. I feel, and a lot of people feel, that the 1950s really are the golden age of baseball, but also of baseball cards and sports cards in general, the 1950s. So my question to you is, what is the greatest card from each of the years in the 1950s? What's the greatest card from 1950? What's the greatest card from 1951 and 52 and 53? Give me a list. Go through each year and tell me what you think the greatest card is from each of those 10 seasons, those 10 years. Now, I'm trying to keep it open. I'm trying to be a broad question because what's the definition of greatest card? Is it the most valuable? Maybe. Is it the most beautiful? Possibly. Is it the most desirable? Potentially. What is it that you think is the greatest card from 1950 and the greatest card from 51 and the greatest card from 52, and 53, and 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59. I want to see your lists, and I want to share with everybody else. And I love doing these lists from you all, because every single time somebody has a couple of cards that they include on their list that says a card that I hadn't really had on my radar as being in that level. And when the video is done, after reading the responses, I'm like, I got to have that card now. I need that card. And included next week, after I share some of your responses and some of the varieties of cards that you all suggest, I'll share mine. I'll go through 50 through 59, what I think the greatest card is. And again, greatest card could mean something different to each and every one of us. That's going to be an interesting one to cover with all of you next week. Now again, if you've not yet done so, if you're interested in getting some really cool shirts that have to do with cards, you're interested in a MidLife sports card shirt or hoodie, go to Reindeer Studios. I'm going to have Scott, the artist, on later in the week in a super fun video that's going to start being a semi-regular video that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. More on that later this week. Mentioned it a little bit during the Friday live stream, but down in the description below, there will be a link. You could check out and get one of his cool Piedmont shirts or polar bear shirts or sweet cap or whatever it is you're interested in. He's got some really cool stuff. So go support Scott, check out his merchandise, and make a purchase. I think you'll really be glad that you did.